Not a problem. I think we will. Okay. So we had done till the verse number 19, up till 18, and we're going to start from verse number 19. Give me 1 second. Yeah. So we're going to start from verse number 19. And in this particular thing, as you know, uh, in this chapter, Bhagwan sort of wanted to explain about his nature to his devotees. And he sort of is going in a roundabout way in order to make it easy for the students to understand. What did he do? He, for example, mentioned what is Kshetra and what is Kshetragya, and he said that if you understand this, then you're kind of prepared and you have full knowledge of what this whole business of being self-aware is. And then he mentions about a certain qualifications which enables a person to reach up to that level of self transparency or clarity or antakarana shuddhi or whatever you call it, to have that required level of sharpness and intuition and freedom from any limitations imposed from previous impressions or sanskaras or any outside connectivity of the senses or the mind with the outside world. If a person has that sort of a thing, so he mentions about this amanikwa, adambitva, titiksha, a lot of qualities like tolerance, non-violence, because these relate to our getting trapped because of our faulty connectivity with the external stimuli or external reality. And then he also talks about what are the internal qualities that we need to have in order to control the mind, they control the manas. And then you have to have pranayama and all, and he has discussed all this in chapter 6. He has already mentioned that in the chapter 13 he is almost summarizing everything he has spoken so far, and that is the most interesting aspect of this chapter. This is the heart of Bhagavad Gita in a certain way. And then he mentions that uh, you know actually, I'm avivakta. I'm just one, but I appear as if I'm divided. I'm different people. People refer to my external aspect and my internal aspect, but these are essentially with the help of superimposed names and forms. That's what he mentioned in the verse number 15. And he says that, that I'm in Jyotisham apita Jyotihi, and that self that we're discussing this, that we want to understand, is actually beyond all that you see as lit up, because there's something which is the prakashaka of everything that is prakashita, because it's sarva vyapaka, sarva bhasaka. It illumines everything. And tamasa paramuchade, and it is that param thing beyond which there's nothing. Jnanam gyam jnana gamyam. That's how he mentions this one thing which is jnana, and that is also jnana, and jnana gamya in the sense that is what we should strive to know about. The same thing is be kind of seen from three vantage points. Same thing appears as three things. That jnana thing that we're going to know about is not a physical object, but it is Chetana Swarupa. It's in fact a state of being aware. It's not outside of ourselves. And iti khetram tatha jnanam gayam choktam samasata. And therefore, I'm saying that this particular thing is called the kshetra. So he's kind of trying to explain the Vedantic secret by referring to the external world and saying that what is that particular thing which is holding everything together, and that pure consciousness is appearing as if it's holding things, because he has to explain to the students why the samsara is appearing as many if actually the Brahman is one. So he has to explain this, and he's giving certain answers to that particular questions. And then if you want to know it, if it's like an object, if it's like physics or chemistry, then you're studying at it. It's like something you're reaching there, and then there will be certain problems with anirmukhya prasanga and that particular nirati sayata, that there is nothing beyond that. Those questions will be put to question, and therefore he's saying this is jnana and this is also jnaya, choktam samasata. And then how do you know it? It's not outside of yourself. And he's saying that the one who sort of understands the qualification is the one who sort of sees me everywhere, and then he sort of gets the truth about myself, he internalizes it. And what does that mean? That essentially means that he becomes nitya mukta, he becomes liberated. Because once he sees this whole universe is permeated by me as somebody, me which is pervading everything, all that is appearing because of me, then he is sort of losing interest in the appearances or the apparent manifestations of my game through Maya that I play or I am said to be playing, because ultimately there is that particular primeval invisible truth about this whole cosmos, and that is one unified truth called the Atma. And only very few people who are doing a lot of analysis, and he's kind of struggling to explain it to us because he knows that we are very dull-minded people, and therefore he has to give a lot of philosophical explanations and he has to bring in a lot of concepts to make sense of it. What is Khetra and what is Khetragya? Now he has mentioned about Khetra and Khetragya. In the next couple of verses, he will now try to bring in a couple of words from Sankhya Darsana, but explain it in a Vedantic way. What we have so far, you remember we have discussed about Kshetra and Kshetra again. In chapter 7, we have talked about Para Prakriti and Apara Prakriti. Apara Prakriti is the material thing, Para Prakriti is that Chetana thing, that consciousness which pervades and which is a kind of thing which does dharana, holds all these material objects, right? That life force. And then if you equate that with Khetra and Khetragya, it will be easy for you to understand. So ultimately, what he's trying to say is in Sankhya, the Purusha is kind of independent and Prakriti is kind of, both are independent, but the Purusha or the Prakriti is completely independent. Purusha is completely independent. But here we are introducing an element called Atma. Why? Because the Purusha he's talking about there is Aneka. So the Vedantic thinkers were sharp enough to realize that we do not have to completely dump Sankhya Darshana. We can accommodate them. What are they talking about? The Sankhya philosophers are talking about consciousness as individual elements. And these are millions and millions of individualities are there. So there'll be millions and millions of Purushas. And that is Sankhya philosophy. So the Vedanti is insightful enough to recognize that I don't need to dump them but make use of them. What they call Purusha is the ultimate thing. I don't have to fight with it. And I would say, yes, that is the ultimate if you're looking at one individual unit. And that is the ultimate thing. But there are certain faulty understandings that you have. I'll clarify it. And then what happens is that Purusha and Prakriti, they are both kind of subsumed by, controlled by the ultimate Atma. And the Purusha in Vedanta, they're saying is different from the Purusha, what is mentioned in the Sankhya Darshana. The Purusha of the Sankhya Darshana is not much different from what Bhagavan refers to as Para Prakriti, that Prana Shakti, Ta Chaitanya Shakti in all the jivas. The Sankhya person will feel very uncomfortable. But if you look at it, actually, there's no fight because it's being very nicely resolved, saying that your innumerable, the imagination of innumerable Purushas can become compatible with Vedanta if we introduce the idea of one unified Atma, where Purushas and Prakritis, that the Sankhya talks about, Prakriti is one, Purusha Aneka, and Bhagavan says, I got no problem with it. They are all part of me. And they are both. And this Purusha and Prakriti are actually Prakriti. One is Para, the other one is Apara. And I can explain it to you. I got no problem with it. And that is what he's trying to now talk about it here. And then the Kshetragya word that we are talking about here, if you flip it a little, that is what? The one thing in us which is being aware of the Kshetra, the Sarira, the everything, all that is knowable. And you're saying, okay, at the individual, at the human level, what is the Kshetragya? I will call it the Paraprakriti, I'll call it also the Purusha, I got no fight. But the ultimate Kshetragya, the Kshetragya yoga I'm discussing here, the ultimate thing, these dualities are all kind of resolved at the level of that ultimate unified reality called Atma. And we are traveling there, traveling not physically, not intellectually, But we are traveling there by traveling away from a few received and faulty notions about how it all works. Okay, so that is how iti kshetram tya jnanam gyam chuktam samasadah madbhakta etad vijnaya madbhavayopapadyate. So he sort of gets this moksha sarvam vasudevamiti. That is that much he has explained. Let's look at the verse number 19, and it's a beautiful two verses. And we have another few verses before this chapter comes to an end, but it'll become easier and easier because the tradition here is that in Bhagavad Gita, he starts with something a little tricky and difficult. Once he has explained it, what he does is that he doesn't walk away from the discourse, but he stays there and then he makes it very easy by giving a few examples where it appears that why is he talking about all this? He has already explained the most difficult chapters. Like after chapter 13, you'll find 14 much easier. After 15, a little intricate philosophical thing, then 16 and 17, again much easier. And of course, 18 kind of is conclusive. He brings in everything to put the conversation to an end. So let's look at the 19th verse. Prakritim purusham chaiva vidhyanadi ubhavapi vikarangsha gunangshaiva vidhi prakriti sambhavan. So he's now trying to talk about Kshetra and Kshetragya. He suddenly is switching and bringing in Purusha and Prakriti. Prakritim Purusham cha eva vidhi. You please know this. Kshetra, Kshetragya, that Purusha and Prakriti. Know them like this. Vidhi, know them. Anadi and Dvivachana. That means both of them are without a beginning. And there is no apparent contradiction with the Sankhya, except that here he will nicely explain what it means. They are not real, they are just projections and superimpositions on the self. Anadi, Ubhavapi, Ubhau api, both of them, Prakriti and Purusha, are without a beginning. There will be a bit of a discussion whether Ishvara creates Prakriti Purusha or they are simultaneously as Ishvara, they are also Anadi. That is what we will deal with it and we will discuss it. Now, the second thing is saying Vikarangsha. And then we also understand the Vikaras. What are the Vikaras? The modifications of the Prakriti. Because Bhagavan already mentioned about the Apara Prakriti, Astadha. Vikarangsha, Gunaksheva, in the Tama, Sattva, and Rajas. Because that Samyavastha, that particular thing is kind of uh, just give me a second, somebody trying to call. So he's saying that Samyavastha, Prakritim Seva, Vidhyanadi Ubhavopi, Vikarangsha, Gunangs Seva, Vidhi, Prakriti Sambhavan, and all these, Vikaras, the modifications that we are discussing, and you understand them, and you also know about the Vikaras, the modifications, the gunas, and how they all happen. And these guna and everything are Prakriti Sambhavan. They are materializing out of what? The Prakriti, if you remember in Sankhya Darshana, the Pradhana or the Mula Prakriti, it is Sattva, Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. They are in Shamyavastha. Now there is Ishwar Shankalpa or whatever, the Purusha, and then because of the Sannidhi with this Chaitanya thing, Prakriti starts behaving even though it's Jada, that it is an agent, and it creates this whole, it creates this whole universe, and it tries to make everything available at the feet of whom it makes everything available at the feet of Purusha for his enjoyment and also for his apavarga. So Vikarangsha Gunang Seva Vidhi Prakriti Sambhavan. So these are all kind of happening from and by the Prakriti. Let's look at Sankara Bhasha because he sort of makes everything nicely clear. Tatra Saptame Ishwarasya Dve Prakriti Upanyaste. So I have already mentioned Bhagavan is saying that so um, have you got disconnected? Give me 1 second. Yeah, there was a call, and again somebody called, and I got disconnected. Are you there, Chinmay?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
Swamiji.
So I'm sorry for the disturbance. And I don't know how to block calls at this moment. So, tatra saptame ishwarasya dve prakriti. So there are these para prakriti and apara prakriti. Upanyaste para pare. So this para and apara, I have mentioned that to you. Kshetra kshetrajna lakshana. So these the same para and apara prakriti. One is kshetra lakshana, the other one is kshetrajna lakshana. The kshetrajna is that chaitanya thing, the conscious thing, and then the kshetra thing is the jada thing, okay, which is in the realm of to be known and the knower, which is the kshetrajna. Etad yonini bhutani iti cha uktam. And then I have also mentioned that etad yonini bhutani, this para and apara prakritis. So these are kind of are born out of this para and aprakriti. Etad yonini bhutani. So born out of this para and apara prakriti are the bhutani, that whole material universe that you see. So iti uktam. Kshetra kshetragyam prakriti dvaya yonitvam. So kshetra and kshetragya, these are the two prakritis, and they are the causes. Unitvam katham bhutanam iti ayam artho adhuna uchyate. So this particular thing, how that happens, how do you explain it? That karanatva, that causative aspect, the causative reality of Kshetra and Kshetrajna, that Prakriti, how do you explain it to me that this material universe has manifested out of them? This I'm explaining to you in this particular verse 19. Prakritim Purusham cha eva Ishwarasya Prakriti tau Prakriti Purushau Ubhau api Anadi Vidhi. So, he will explain it later on. How Brahman becomes Ishvara, we have already explained that, and he will repeat it here. He will go to much deeper explanations in this verse, Shankaracharya. He's saying that, look here, these are two aspects. So, Prakritin Purusham cha eva Ishwarasya Prakriti. Prakriti and Purusha. For Sankhya, Purusha is not Prakriti. Okay? And there is no Vikara, and it is some. Uh, okay, because there is no fan. Are you getting some noise in now? Is it better?
Yes, Swamiji.
Yeah, I just brought the phone to the front. Maybe the computer sound is being captured. That
Yes,
fan,
Swamiji.
the computer fan noise maybe is capturing. So, what he's trying to say is Prakriti Purusham Cheva Ishwarasya Prakriti Tau Prakriti Purusha Ubhau api Anadi Vidhi. Please understand this Prakriti and Purusha. They both are Prakriti. For Sankhya, one is Purusha, and he's considered to be much superior, and he's absolutely not touched by anything. But what the Vedanta says, yes, what you call Purusha is actually Prakriti of Ishvara. It's just one aspect of him, it's also Prakriti. And this is one significant difference that one has to keep in mind. Prakriti Purusha Ubhau Api Anadi. And this is one concession, the similarity. Both Purusha and Prakriti are also kind of accepted as Anadi. That is one interesting thing. Now, they are both anadi, but they are not ananta, because if they become ananta, then there will be no moksha, there will be no mukti. So here, they are kind of layers of superimpositions on the atma, and when we have that ekakara bhava, that aikya bhava, that everything is one, then we are kind of liberated. Means for us, there is no purusha, no prakriti, because they are ultimately certain names and forms, superimpositions happening with the Brahman, and then the Ishwaratva is kind of perceived, and then the whole reality appears as real, fundamentally real. But that is not fundamentally real. That is all in a phenomenal sense. We are real, and then when we transcend, then there is nothing holding us back. That was the point. Yeah, the fan is very active, and I can also hear the noise of the fan. Okay, then we are going forward. Vanadi. Na vidyate adihi yayoho tau anadi. Now this is there will be some philosophical and grammatical argument, and stay alert because this is a critical thing to be able to understand our perspective, Vedantic perspective on these two prakritis and why they need to be anadi and what if they are Ishvara Krita, if we can imagine like that. There are certain people trying to misinterpret that Purusha Prakriti or whatever mentioned. They would say that no, Krishna Bhagavan did everything. He is the origin of everything. And because of his sankalpa, he's doing everything. And what are the philosophical problems if we talk like that? He's explaining here. Na vidyate adihi yayo tau anadi. So those two, this para-prakriti and apara-prakriti, which are now referred to as Purusha and Prakriti, they both are anadi. How this vigrah is done? Na vidyate adihi yayoho. These two whose adi doesn't exist. Na vidyate adihi yayoho. Tau. These two are anadi. Ditya, the dvivachana is mentioned. Nityatvad ishwarasya tat prakrityoho api yuktam nityatvena bhavitum. Because Ishvara is, Bhagavan has mentioned that I am anadi because everything begins because of me. So I cannot be having one adi, I cannot be sadi, I cannot have a beginning. I'm beyond all beginnings. Then only anything that has come into force, anything that has come into existence, you can argue that Bhagavan brought it or Bhagavan was the creator. If you mention a certain point in history to be the beginning of God, then whatever existed prior to that point of time on the mega time scale will go beyond the creative genius or the powers or whatever of the God. Therefore, God is without a beginning. Everything else is with a beginning. And God is without an end. Everything else has an end. That is what we have discussed earlier. And he's saying that because God is Nitya, Ishvara is Nitya, the word is not God, it's Ishvara. And now, if you say Ishvara is Nitya, which is Anadi Ananta, and then what happens is that he becomes Ishvara how? He becomes Ishvara because he has this these prakritis with him. Without this prakriti, you can neither call him Ishvara. Okay? He is much beyond. He's a super relative reality without any names and forms. And therefore he's saying it's very important for you to understand that these are also Nitya because Ishvara is Nitya. Prakriti Dvyavatvam eva Ishwarasya Ishwaratvam. This is the most important sentence. The having these two qualities, two prakritis, para and apara, this consciousness and the material reality, this particular aspect of Ishvara is what makes him Ishvara. That means what? You cannot say that our life, like for example, our body and our consciousness, can we separate ourselves from our body and consciousness? Let's think about it. Even when the baby begins to form, can you say that the body was formed after that consciousness came, or you can think that first consciousness came, that body came, or you can say that the baby kind of comes first and then body and consciousness come? No, they all come simultaneously. So the Jivatva and Ishwaratva, the way the Jivatva cannot be separated from the Kshetra and Kshetrajna thing in that particular individual unit, same way at the Samasti level, at the cosmic level, the Ishwara's Ishwaratva is nothing other than these two aspects playing out. That is what playing out of these two aspects is what makes the Atma or the Brahman look like Ishvara. Because these names and forms then appear to make sense phenomenally. We can make sense of the Srishti and all these things are happening. He's Sarvagya and he's Sarvavidyaman, he's Sarvasaktiman. Because there is creation, he's doing all that. And he's doing all that because of these two prakritis, without which manifestation will not become possible. And therefore, Shankaracharya beautifully says that, his Ishwaratvam has to be understood in the light of these two. Fundamentally, there is nothing called Ishwaratva in dissociation from, if you remove from the discussion these two prakritis with which Bhagavan becomes Bhagavan. It is like a person becomes a police officer because he has this rank, and if you cannot separate them, saying that the police officer exists without that rank, without that job description. There could be quite a few officers who don't have a portfolio. They have the degree, but nobody gives them any importance. They are not. I mean, they're just like a government officer. No different. They'll get a salary, you come to their account, but then nothing happens. The life is pretty miserable because the functionality is dissociated from them. Okay, so therefore, Bhagavan says this very powerful sentence, what he mentions here, that Prakriti Dvaya Vatvam Eva, having these two qualities, two aspects of Prakritis, is Ishwarasya Ishwaratvam, because then that Atma becomes Ishwara, it creates, controls, and Yabhyam Prakritivhyam Ishwara. And by these Prakritis, Jagat Utpati Sthiti Pralaya Hetuhu, Te Dve Anadi Satyo Sansarasya Karanam. Now, with the help of these two Prakritis, this Ishvara becomes all powerful. Jagat Utpati Sthiti Pralaya Hetuhu. Bhagavan is seen as the Sthiti, Utpati, and Laya Hetu because of the beginning, appearance, then sustenance or continuation, and destruction or coming to an end of this whole material universe is attributed to God. Bhagavan says that I am the Grasishnu and Prahavishnu. As we discussed that Bhagavan creates in Prahavishnu, we say he also Grasishnu, everything. And Bhagavan says, the way the rivers get into the sea, all these people you see, they all die in me. And he saw that in the Vishwarupa Darshana. Is Bhagavan killing anyone? No, Bhagavan is not doing anything. So, and then how do we tell that story? Bhagavan says that only when you take into account these two prakritis, then you can make sense of how the Srishti, the Sthiti, and the Pralaya happen. And then you also attribute them to me. I don't have any problem because you're attributing them to me via two concepts of para and apara prakriti, or purusha and prakriti. Okay, so these two are also, and then these two prakritis, because of which this Srishti Sthiti Pralaya of the whole material universe is attributable to me. Now, can we make it simpler? You see how beautifully he's persuading us. Can we make it simpler that this Purusha and Prakriti are actually samsara karan? This whole manifest universe, you look at Purusha and Prakriti. What are these? The two Prakritis of mind. Now he's explaining the controversial philosophical interpretation. What are the problems if we interpret like that? He says, "Na adi anadi." जिसका आदि नहीं है वो अनादि. That is one samasa, one way of interpreting it. The one which doesn't have a beginning is beginningless. Okay. If a person, if you say shirtless, a man who doesn't have a shirt is shirtless. Okay. Now you twist it. We call somebody inhuman. That means he's not human. We say, like for example, wherever you have a ninth of Purusha Samasa, you just add, like avigya, anavigya. So there is no experience with him, right? So instead of doing bahuvrihi, you just call it ninth of Purusha, like Ghata, na ghata, aghata, like that. You just add one na, it becomes a. So if you say na adi anadi, means which is not adi, that is anadi. Na adi anadi means what will mean that Prakriti and Purusha, they are anadi. What will mean? They are not the beginning of this universe. Bhagavan is adi, they have come later on. So no adi anadi, this is one interpretation by certain over enthusiastic, philosophically inclined people who cannot see the complications they are bringing in by referring to Purusha and Prakriti, or the Para and Apara Prakriti, is Na Adi Anadi. They are not the first one. Who is the first one? God. Why they interpret like this? Anadi it tatpurusha samasam kechid varnayanti. Some people have this kind of an interpretation. Tena hi kila ishwarasya karanakam siddhati. They say then only can we establish the causative potential, the causative power of God, of Ishvara. Why? Because Prakriti Purusha cannot create, because they are created by God and then things are happening. Ultimately, who is the source of all this creation? It is Bhagavan. That we can discuss. So let's not interpret Purusha Prakriti as Anadi as kind of co-terminus with the existence of God, because then they will become the creators. What is the role of God? That is their fear. Karanatma. Yadi punaha prakriti purushau eva nityau shatam. If these two people become nitya, they become co-terminus with God in terms of whatever existence they have. Tat kritam eva jagat na ishwarasya jagataha kartutvam. They have this fear. They are very dedicated to God. They are over enthusiastic people on the social media who speak on behalf of their leader much more forcefully than the leader himself. So that is how he's saying that Yadi Punaha Prakriti Purusho Eva Nityo Shatam Tat Kritam Eva Jagat Jagan Na Ishwarasya Jagadha Kartutvam. Then the samsara, the kartutva or the causative agency will be attributed to the Purusha and Prakriti. Bhagavan will lose his importance. That is what is their fear. Tad asat. That is not true. Shankaracharya is refuting it. That kind of an apprehension is saying that asat. That is not true. प्राक् प्रकृति पुरुषयोः उत्पत्तेः इसितव्य अभावात् ईश्वरस्य अनिश्चरत्व प्रसंगात्. What happens is that for him, you see, he's a Vedanti, he's a Kevala Vedanti, Advaita Vedanti. Because he's Kevala Advaita Vedanti, for him to imagine our Ishvara dissociated from, free from names and forms, is bringing some problems. For a Vaishnava guy, for a Shaiva guy, imagining our Ishvara, which is free from Prakriti Purusha, no problem, because for them, Brahman is not different from this Ishvara. Ishvara is Brahman only for them. So they can have that kind of an interpretation and they have absolutely no problem. But for a Advaita Vedanti, who absolutely is all the time emphasizing that the ultimate thing, the Brahman, is without any name and form. That is his, key contribution. And therefore, he cannot attribute any agency, any name and form, any, omnipotence, and or omniscience, and all these things, the omni things, that adjectives, omni adjectives we associate with Ishvara. He doesn't associate them with Brahman. He associates them with Ishvara in a specific context by explaining that because of these prakritis, which are attributions, the Brahman, with this Maya Upadhi, with this prakriti kind of becoming associated with him, he's explaining this samsara is existing. And for him, it's all easy. But ultimately, this Ishvara is just also an appearance for him. And beyond Ishvara, there is this Brahman. So he has to keep his eye on the ultimate destination, the ultimate truth that he has to explain. And therefore, if we can imagine our Ishvara, which is prior to the appearance of these two prakritis, because they are avhasavadis, the Advaita Vedantis in the ultimate sense that these realities are all appearances. When they were created, because creation, the story of creation is fundamentally not true. It's just an appearance. The snake which appears on the rope doesn't have a date of birth, but it's just an appearance. And its date of birth depends on the who is the guy who's looking at it. There's a girl who enters the room and looks at the snake, and that moment the snake appears. There is no snake as such. So this whole samsara, whether and when it was created, who created it, we'll explain to you how it gets created, who created it. But when it got created is an irrelevant question. Why? Because it depends on who is the person who entered that room and saw that snake. The snake instantly got created. So this is Drishti Shishtivasa and Avhasavada. It's kind of appearing as if it exists. Therefore, the Ishwaratva is not very fundamental to Advaita Vedanta because there is a state beyond Ishvara, even though they are used interchangeably, whereas the Vishishta Advaitavadins will use Ishvara as the fundamental ultimate truth. But the Advaita Vedantis, Ishvara is kind of penultimate state, and that is also the subtlest, but still an appearance with certain adjectives, names, and forms. And there is a state beyond that where there's nothing but this unified truth, where the Bhakta and the Bhagavan, they don't exist differently. So he is kind of explaining that, and he's saying, na adi, then yadi punaha prakriti purusho eva nityo sataha, sorry, tad asat prag prakriti purushoyoho utpatehe isitabhya bhavat. So before the creation, prakriti purusha, then isitabhya, that, this capacity to desire doesn't exist. Why? Brahman is, no, it's nirvikara, nirguna, niskriya. So how will you do sankalpa? How can you attribute that Bhagavan plans to do it? When he appears as Ishvara, then he can do have this kalpana sakti and saikhyata, vahusham prajaya. All these will happen. But before he reaches there, before, we begin to see it that way, how do we talk about this whole creation? That is the challenge for him. And therefore he's saying Prakriti Purusha, this whole thing. Before this, if you imagine about Ishvara, then the Ishitabhya, he cannot do Sankalpa without the benefit of Ishvara, these Prakritis. He cannot create this universe because it's Niskriya, Nirguna, Nirakara, Nishanga, Ishvara, Anishvarata Prasanga, because he cannot create all this. Sansarasya, Ninnimitatve, then if you see that the samsara can come out without any cause, any nimitta karana, without any fundamental thing, anirmukhyatva prasangacha, and then what? That the samsara can exist without any cause. They are self-made if you think like this. Then also there is a big problem that because now what? Because of Prakriti, the samsara appears as real to us. So as Advaita Vedantis, for what? How the samsara will get destroyed? When we have jnana. That means we do not anymore consider these prakritis as real. We say these are theories, these are all fine because we have reached at a level they don't matter to us, and therefore we get moksha. For a guy who considers all them as real, and the prakriti thing, you think samsara is created directly by God, that will, this nirnimitta, so that nimitta that we attribute to these prakritis, and as a result of which this whole material universe has come into being, without any cause, so then there will be anirmukhya prasangat, and you will not get mukti because if it's Ishvara Krita, Ishvara is Nitya, and Ishvara Krita, Sansar will also become Nitya. Because Ishvaratva itself is also a guise. It's like a person dressing up as Jadugar, that he shows magic. If the person is the Jadugar by birth, that very nature is a Jadugar, like a tiger is a tiger, then his jadoo will happen from birth to death. There will be nothing called magic show. It will happen. That's what he's saying. That then prasangat, sastra anarthakya prasangat. And then he's saying that the sastra, why should you study? Because the sansara is going to continue. Because Ishwar is also nitya, and he's creating the sansara. It's also nitya. Bandha mukhya bhava prasangatcha, and then bandha and mukhya. So now what we understand. If you do not understand what is tetra tetragya, how the prakriti work, you are abadha. When you understand, then you get liberation. That you are removing. Ishvara has created everything. Fundamentally, everything is real. So there is no moksha. Nityatve punar ishvarasya prakrutyoho sarvam etad utpavan bhavet. And then nityatve punaha, and then nityat punar ishvarasya prakrutyoho sarvam etad upapannam bhavet. And then he's saying no. But if you consider actually these this Prakriti Purusha, it's much easier to explain that simultaneously, and the Ishwarasya Ishwaratvam can be attributed to the presence of these two things. And they kind of follow him, and therefore this whole thing can materialize. Katham Vikarangsa Gunakseva. How does that happen? He explained. Vikarangsa Gunakseva. All the vikaras, the modifications of this particular thing, and guna seva, and all these qualities raja, tama, and sattva, Bhakshamanan, what has been already mentioned. Vikaran, these are the modifications, changes. Buddhyadi, Deha, Indriyan, Tan, Gunaksha. And what are the Vikaras modifications? Deha, Indriya, right? You have the body and you have the Karmendriyas and Gyanendriyas and Manas and the Panchabhutas, all these Vikaras. And then buddhi and ahankara and manas, if you also take that into account, all the vikaras and gunans and all these qualities that you take into account, sattva, tama, and rajas, and sukha, dukkha, moha, pratyakara, parinatan. And then you see how he's saying that how he's trying to include the experience of sukha, dukkha, and everything in these, because he has not mentioned that, if you remember, the 25 tattva, the 24 tattvas, 25 tattvas that we studied in Sankhya or in the earlier verses in this chapter, what have we studied? That we have these Prakriti, and then you have Mahatattva, and there is Buddhi, and there's Ahankara, right? So, and then you have what? You have Manas, and you have the Tanamatras, right? Buddhi, Ahankara, Tanamatras. These are the Prakriti, Vikriti. And you have Mula Prakriti. After that, you have Manas and five Jnanendriyas, five Karmendriyas, right? And Panchabhutas. That's 24. Where did we count Sukha Dukkha? So, how do you account for this Sukha Dukkha? And this is beautifully explained here. This Sukha Dukkha, how do you experience actually? You experience with the help of your mind, right? So, if a person doesn't have a mind, if a person is cognitively deranged, there is something called a split personality. How does that happen? There's a person who has a mental problem. So he comes and says, "Do you know my dad died or my daughter died?" And how is he saying? He's laughing. And that's what we refer to as a split personality because there is no alignment. He's laughing, but he has actually lost somebody who's very dear to him, but he doesn't understand because that mind is kind of not integrated or functioning. Similarly, a person in a state of depression may be trusting the person who is also trying to hurt him. On the other hand, there's a person, because of a disturbed mind or because of a confused mind, might actually hate a person who is trying to help him. He might suspect. These things happen during neurosis. So the experience of sukha, dukkha, and everything are happening with the help of manas, the mind. Now, can we refer to them as products of the mind? Yes. So they, when we mention manas, we are including sukha, dukkha, all these. These are mental modifications. They are modifications of the mind, and therefore pratyakara parinatan. So these experiences, these pratyas, these anubhavas, they are essentially modifications of the mind, which is vidhi, janihi. Please understand prakriti sambhavan, and they are kind of modifications of that para and apara prakriti. The apara prakriti, para prakriti here. Prakriti Prakriti Ishwarasya Vikara Karana Sakti Trigunaatmika Maya. And then this Prakriti is Vikara, this modification is Karana Sakti, Vikara Karana Sakti, Trigunaatmika Maya, Sa Sambhavo Yesam Vikaranam. And this Maya, because of which everything is happening, is Maya Sakti. Sambhavo Yesam Vikaranam Gunanam. So Tan Vikaran Gunaksha, and all these modifications as well as these qualities, three qualities, sattva, rajas, tamas, vidhi. Because what happens is, what he's trying to say is, that we'll explain in chapter 14 and 16, you will see that whatever we are doing, whatever you are experiencing, you can categorize them as overwhelmingly influenced by sattvic quality or rajasic quality or tamasic quality. So first he explains the modifications of the manas, of the mind, and other things, the way the body, the karmendriyas. Now, if there's a overwhelming influence of, I mean, those who study statistics will understand because it's basically a multivariate situation. So you have these three forces, sattva, tama, and rajas, they're influencing, and then we have a few more variables, out of which we have a range of new variables which are coming up, and these three things, which are on the top, sattva, tama, and rajas, they're kind of, you know, becoming coefficients with these indriyas and the karma indriyas and all, and the modifications, the products thereof, and then these will have certain sattvic or tamasic or or rajasic qualities. So, like for example, a dream state. This is a modification of the mind, and we are in the sleep state, and we see a certain dream. Now, how do you qualify that as a sattvic dream or a rajasic dream? Depending on what sort of dream you're seeing, and we will do that anumana, we'll do that inferencing based on what did you see, what are the indications, what kind of food you consume, what is the state, were you very upset, whether there's a bit of tension in it. Depending on that, you can say, no, it was a sattvic dream or a tamasic dream or a rajasic dream. It's like that. All activities, including your thought, your activities, your creativities, we can qualify that and put them in these two quarters. Ishwarasya, and then Maya Samaviyesam Vikaranam Gunanang Cha Tan Vikaran Gunaksha Vidhi Prakriti Sambhavan Prakriti Parinaman. So they are kind of modifications. That is how he's explaining. If you look at Madhusudana for this verse number 19 is much simpler, but this is, I would say, deserves attention because he sort of makes it much simpler than what you saw in Sankaracharya, where he does it, but Madhusudana is making it even much easier. Tad anena granthena, tad kshetram, yacha, yadritya, ityetad vakyatam. So we have already mentioned Bhagavan. How is this truth about me? Yacha yadritya, the way it is, I'll tell you. And out of which whatever happens, and yatah yacha, and out of which whatever happens of these Kshetra and Kshetranya Bhagavan has earlier mentioned, and therefore says this is what is now explained in detail in this part. Idanin yad vikari yatascha yat, that vikari, these modifications, coming out of what? Of the out of Prakriti. That is what I'm going to explain to you. Yat sacha yaha yat prabhava cha ityedad vakhyatavyam. And then I'm going to explain to you what I have already explained, what I'm going to explain. He's making this small differences in there. Tatra prakriti purusha yaha, and there prakriti and purusha sansara hetu kathanena, and they are the causative, the story of how this whole universe comes into being. Kathanena. Okay, we are exceeding time, but this let's finish this verse at least. Kathanena yad vikari yatascha yad iti prakritim ityadi dvabhyam prapanchete. So he expands it in these two verses. Sacha yo yad prabhavascha iti tu purusha इत्यादि द्वाभ्याम इति विवेकः. So such a yo yat prabhavascha, as a result of which what happens is referring to that tat purusha, and he's saying, explaining tatcha iti tu purusha ityadi purusha and prakriti and all that he's saying. Now what is interesting here, now please pay attention here. तत्र सप्तमे ईश्वरस्य द्वे प्रकृति परापरे क्षेत्र क्षेत्रज्ञ लक्षणे Upanasya, Bhagavan has already mentioned, because this is one sort of makes the mind very confused in the say in students of Bhagavad Gita. Para Prakriti kya hai? Apara Prakriti kya hai? Para Prakriti, is it different from Bhagavan or is Bhagavan? This is a constant doubt will come to your mind. And what is Kshetrajna? Is Bhagavan or is different from Bhagavan? How can you do Vivek of Kshetrajna? Why is he discussing all that? And then he's saying that, it's one thing, and then I appear like this, it's confusing me so much. So, and then he's introducing two more words, Prakriti and Purusha. I'm kind of completely confused. So he's clarifying that. Saptame Ishwarasya Dve Prakriti Parapare Kshetra Kshetrajna Lakshane Upanasya Etad Yonini, and out of these two Prakritis, whole Sansara, Etani Bhutani, Prakriti Maya Kya Trigunatmika, and that Prakriti has three aspects, Sattva, Tamas, and Rajas, Parameshwari Sakti. Parameshwari Sakti, Parameshwari, because he is associated with this ultimate creator of this whole universe, Parameshwari Sakti. Kshetra Lakshana Ya Prag Apara Prakriti Iti Uktaha. So he's saying that, this Jadatmika thing, Astadha, first is mentioned about the Apara Prakriti. Apara Prakriti Iti Uktaha. Yatu Para Prakriti Jivakya, that Jiva Rupa, that Chaitanya thing, it sort of is holding everything. Everyone is active and everything because of that power of this life force in all of us. He's saying, तत्र Aparaha, okay. Then Prakritim iti Prakriti Mayakya Trigunaत्मिका, that is fine. Ya tu para Prakriti Jivakya Pragukta Sa Iha Purusha iti Ukta iti na Purva para Virudha. Same para Prakriti is now being referred to as Purusha in this chapter. Prakritim Purusham cha Ubhau api Anadi eva Vidhi. Please understand Prakriti and Purusha both as Anadi. What Shankaracharya says, he's further elaborating. Na vidyate adihi karanam yayo tau. The ones who do not have a beginning. Tatha प्रकृति sorry तथा प्रकृतेः अनादित्वम सर्व जगत कारणत्वात्. Why they are anadi? Because all the samsara is possible because of the play of these two prakritis, but not independent of Ishvara, but as part of an aspect of Ishvara. Tasyapi, tasya, that of prakriti, tasya api karanata apekhyatve anavastha prasangat. And then if you say that that prakriti has another karana, acha, who is the cause of that cause and who is the cause of that cause, and then you have that regression without an end. So anavastha prasangat, purushasya anaditvam, tad dharma dharma prayuktatvat. And purusha is also, because this dharma, because it is having these qualities that you are attributing it, and therefore that is also anaditva. Because dharma is papa punya, whatever you can call it, and then jivas are also considered anadi, and of these six anadis. And because how this consciousness is formed in us, good, bad, ugly, disciplined, indisciplined, lazy or very proactive or very balanced. It has a lot to do with our past sanskaras of dharma and adharma, and because that is sort of is informing it, and that doesn't have a beginning. Where we came, how the whole thing started, we don't know. Jiva is anadi, pravyatva, that is also anadi. That is how it's kind of concluding there. कृष्णस्य जगतः जातस्य हर्ष शोक भय संप्रतिपत्तेः अन्यथा क्रोधहानि अकृताभ्य अभ्यागम प्रसंगात. And there is this whole logic in Mimamsa in Indian philosophy. They'll always mention kritahani and krita vipranasha akrita abhyagata. So what you haven't done, you are getting result for this, and what you have done is destroyed. What you haven't, and what you didn't want, and that is happening. So that is a double, it's like a double problem for you. Okay, so he's explaining that. So if you do that, there is a big problem, and we're not going to go there, and therefore this harsha, shoka, all these emotions that we experience with the Purusha, and then that is kind of reinforced by our Purva Papa Punya, and then we cannot fix a certain date, then we'll have much difficulty in explaining because it has dharma, its causative factors. If we put a date, how would you explain how Papa or Punya started? So we say that this is a cycle of repetitions, and the Purusha Prakriti both are anadi. यतः प्रकृतिः अनादि अतः तस्य भूतयोनि त्वम् उक्तं प्राग उत्पद्यते इत्याह विकारानिति. And then, in the sloka Bhagavan says that you please know this, that this prakriti and is anadi, and that's why it's etad yonini. These two prakritis I have mentioned even earlier in the seventh chapter. Vikarasa shodasa. What are these shodasa vikaras? You have pancha bhutas and pancha karmendriyas, pancha gyanendriyas, and manas. These are the 16s. These are complete vikaras. Pancha muhabhutani ekadasa indriyani cha. So pancha and ekadasa indriyani, karmendriya, gyanendriya, and these mahabhutas, they are 16. Gunaksa sattvatama raja rupan, tama rupan, sukha dukkha mohan prakriti sambhavan eva. And then the sukha dukkha are also products of this prakriti. Prakriti karana eva vidhi janihi. And then you understand this emotional of the experiences that you have. These are also products of this prakriti. So we'll hold it here. We have exceeded the time, and then we'll take it forward from tomorrow. If you have any questions, you can ask. Otherwise, I'm going to put this to an end.